The day they told me I had to marry him, I was hanging laundry on the line behind my grandmother's house. The cotton sheets snapped in the wind like sails, and I remember thinking how free they looked, how they could just float away if I let them go. "Isla!" my grandmother called from the porch, her voice carrying that particular weight that meant the decision had already been made. "Come inside. The elders want to speak with you." I was 23 years old, living in Pine Haven, a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, tucked into the valleys of eastern Kentucky, where my family had lived for 6 generations. After my parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier, I'd moved back from Lexington to care for my grandmother. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being strong. The living room smelled like coffee and old wood. 5 of them sat there: Mrs. Cordelia Hayes, Mr. Jasper Brennan, Mrs. Lou Ann Fletcher, Reverend Polk, and my grandmother. Their faces were serious, the kind of serious that comes before life changes without asking permission. "We need to talk about the Sutherland situation," Mrs. Hayes began, her fingers laced together on her lap. Everyone in Pine Haven knew about the Sutherlands. They owned the mill that employed half the town. When Garrett Sutherland came back from overseas paralyzed from the waist down 2 years ago, it broke something in the community. He'd been the golden boy, quarterback, valedictorian, the one who'd made it out and come back a hero. Now he lived alone in that big house on the hill, refusing visitors, refusing help, refusing life. "His mother passed last month," Reverend Polk said gently. "He has no one. The mill is struggling without proper leadership. The whole town is suffering." I didn't understand what this had to do with me until my grandmother spoke. "They need someone to care for him, Isla. Someone young enough to manage the household, strong enough to handle the responsibility. In exchange, he'll sign over a portion of the mill profits to the community fund. It would save 43 families from losing their livelihoods." The room tilted slightly. "You're asking me to marry him?" "We're not asking," Mrs. Hayes said, and though her voice was soft, it was final. "Your grandmother's medical bills are substantial. The house is mortgaged. You have no prospects here, no future. This arrangement benefits everyone." I looked at my grandmother, searching for an ally, but her eyes were tired and sad and resolute. "He's a good man, Isla," she whispered. "Broken, but good, and you've always had a gift for seeing the best in people." They gave me 3 days to prepare. 3 days to accept that my life was being traded like currency, that I was going to marry a stranger, that the sheets on the line would never be as free as I'd imagined. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday. The wedding took place in the small chapel at the edge of town, the same one where my parents had been married, where their funeral had been held. I wore my mother's dress, ivory lace that smelled like cedar and lavender from the trunk where it had been stored. My grandmother fastened the buttons with shaking hands. "You look beautiful," she said, but her eyes were wet. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood there and let her pin wildflowers into my hair, because what else could I do? 43 families, the mill, my grandmother's house. The weight of an entire town rested on my shoulders like a yoke. There were maybe 20 people in attendance, no celebration, no joy, just witnesses to a transaction. Mrs. Hayes played the piano, something slow and somber that felt more like a dirge than a wedding march. Garrett Sutherland waited at the altar in his wheelchair. I'd seen him before, of course, but always from a distance. Up close, he was different than I remembered. His face was harder, older than his 28 years. Dark hair, sharp jawline, eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a black suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, and his hands gripped the armrests of his chair like he was holding on to the edge of a cliff. When I reached him, he didn't smile, didn't look relieved or grateful. He looked angry. Reverend Polk spoke about duty and covenant and commitment, words that felt hollow in the small chapel. When it came time for vows, Garrett's voice was flat, mechanical. "I do." Mine was barely a whisper. "I do." The Reverend pronounced us married, and Garrett didn't even try to kiss me. He just turned his wheelchair around and headed for the door, leaving me standing there in my mother's dress, feeling like I'd just signed away my soul. The reception was held at the community hall. Sandwiches and sweet tea, people making awkward small talk, avoiding the obvious truth that this wasn't a marriage, it was a business arrangement. Garrett sat in the corner, accepting congratulations with cold nods, his jaw tight. I caught him staring at me once, not with kindness or curiosity, but with something that looked like resentment, like I was the enemy, like I'd done this to him. When the sun began to set, Mrs. Hayes touched my shoulder. "It's time," she said gently. "Jasper will drive you both to the house." The Sutherland estate sat on 12 acres of land overlooking the valley. The house was Victorian, 3 stories of white paint and black shutters, beautiful and lonely. Mr. Brennan helped Garrett into the house, while I carried my single suitcase up the front steps. Inside, everything was pristine and cold. Hardwood floors, antique furniture, photographs of a family that no longer existed. "Your room is upstairs," Garrett said from his wheelchair, not looking at me. "Second door on the right. I sleep down here. We stay out of each other's way. That's the arrangement." "Garrett, don't," he cut me off, his voice sharp. "Don't pretend this is something it isn't. You're here because they paid you to be here. I'm here because I have no choice. Let's just survive this with whatever dignity we have left." He wheeled himself down the hall and closed a door behind him with a definitive click. I stood alone in the foyer of my new prison, still wearing my mother's wedding dress, and finally let myself cry. The first week in that house felt like living in a museum where I was both curator and unwanted guest. Garrett kept to his routine with military precision. Coffee at 6, work in his study until noon, lunch alone, more work, dinner at 7 sharp. He communicated through notes left on the kitchen counter. Groceries needed, mail on my desk by 3 p.m., keep the noise down in the evenings. I tried to respect his boundaries, but the silence was suffocating. The house itself told stories he wouldn't. Photographs lined the hallway. Garrett as a boy with his parents, teenage Garrett holding football trophies, Garrett in his army uniform standing proud and whole. In every picture he was smiling. The man in the wheelchair never smiled. I spent my days cleaning rooms that were already clean, cooking meals he barely touched, and walking the property when the walls closed in too tight. The garden behind the house had gone wild. Roses choked by weeds, stone pathways cracked and uneven. I started working on it, pulling invasive vines, trimming dead branches. It gave me purpose, something to control when everything else felt impossible. On the 8th day, I found Garrett in his study, surrounded by ledgers and papers, his face drawn with exhaustion. "The mill reports," he said without looking up. "They don't make sense. Numbers are off. Someone's been skimming, or they're just incompetent. Either way, we're bleeding money." It was the first real thing he'd said to me. Not an order, not a dismissal, just honesty. "Can I help?" I asked from the doorway. He finally looked at me, surprise flickering across his face before the walls went back up. "You know accounting?" "I was 2 semesters from my business degree before," I trailed off. "Before my parents died, before everything changed." Something shifted in his expression, too quick to name. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "See if you can make sense of the payroll discrepancies." We worked in silence for 3 hours. I found the problems: double entries, miscategorized expenses, simple errors compounded over months. When I showed him, he leaned back and ran a hand through his hair. "How did I miss this?" "You're one person trying to do everything," I said carefully. "That's impossible for anyone." His eyes met mine, and for just a moment the anger wasn't there, just exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. It became our routine. Mornings in the study, sorting through the chaos of the mill's finances.
He was brilliant when he talked about the business, strategic, passionate, alive in ways he wasn't anywhere else. I learned that he'd planned to modernize the mill before his injury, to expand into sustainable lumber practices, to create something that would last generations. "Why did you stop?" I asked one afternoon. His jaw tightened. "Because everyone looks at me and sees what I can't do anymore. They see the wheelchair, not the person. The elders didn't ask me to marry you because they thought I needed a partner. They did it because they thought I needed a nurse. They've already written me off." "I don't see you that way," I said. He laughed, bitter and sharp. "You don't see me at all, Isla. You're here because you had to be. Let's not pretend otherwise." But he was wrong. I was starting to see him. The intelligence behind the anger, the grief behind the walls, the man he used to be fighting against the reality of who he'd become. That night, I lay in my room and thought about the wedding vows, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, words I'd spoken without meaning them, binding me to a stranger who wouldn't let me close enough to matter. Downstairs, I heard movement, Garrett's wheelchair on the hardwood, the sound of glass clinking. I wondered if he couldn't sleep either, if he felt the same restless loneliness that filled every corner of this big, empty house. I wondered what it would take for either of us to be free.
3 weeks into the marriage, something strange happened. I'd gone into town to pick up supplies, and when I mentioned I was Mrs. Sutherland now, the reactions were odd. The woman at the hardware store got quiet, exchanged glances with her coworker. The pharmacist asked how Garrett was managing with a tone that felt loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. At the grocery store, I ran into Darlene Morris, a woman who'd been a year ahead of me in high school. "I heard about the wedding," she said, loading canned goods into her cart. "That must be difficult for you." "It's an adjustment," I said carefully. She lowered her voice, leaning closer. Do you feel safe, with his temper and everything?" I stiffened. "Garrett's never been anything but civil to me." "That's good," she said, but she didn't look convinced. "Just be careful, okay? Men like that, when they've lost everything, they can be unpredictable." "Men like what?" I wanted to ask, but she'd already moved on, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. When I got home, Garrett was in the living room, staring out the window at the valley below. The afternoon light cut across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "People in town talk about you," I said, setting the groceries on the counter. "I'm aware." "They act like you're dangerous, like you're some kind of ticking time bomb." He turned his wheelchair to face me, and his expression was unreadable. "And what do you think?" "I think they don't know you." "Neither do you." "Then tell me," I said, surprising myself with the force in my voice. "Tell me what happened, not the official story, the real one." For a long moment, he just looked at me. Then he wheeled himself to the window again, his back to me. "I was part of a convoy outside Kandahar," he said quietly. IED took out the vehicle in front of us. I was the ranking officer, made the call to proceed, thought we'd cleared the route. Second device got us. Killed my driver instantly. Medic lost his legs. I woke up in a hospital in Germany with a severed spinal cord and 3 men dead because of my decision. The room felt too small for the weight of his words. When I came home, everyone wanted to call me a hero, throw parades, give me medals, tell me how brave I was. But all I could think about was Jenkins, my driver, and how his wife was pregnant with their first child, how he'd shown me the ultrasound picture the morning we deployed, how that baby would grow up without a father because I made the wrong call. His hands grouped the armrests of his wheelchair, knuckles white. "The paralysis is what I deserve," he said. "It's justice. And everyone in this town looking at me with pity or fear or whatever else, they're right to. I'm not the man I was. I'm not the man anyone wanted me to be." I crossed the room and knelt beside his wheelchair, forcing him to look at me. "You made a decision in an impossible situation," I said. "That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human. You don't understand. I understand that you've been punishing yourself for 2 years, that you've locked yourself in this house, pushed everyone away, convinced yourself that you don't deserve peace or happiness or even basic human connection. But Garrett, those men didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life in a prison of your own making. His eyes were wet, and I realized I'd never seen him this vulnerable, this raw. "I can't walk," he whispered. "I can't be the person this town needs. I can't even be a real husband to you." "I didn't ask for a hero," I said softly. "I just asked for honesty." Something broke in him then, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a dam with a crack finally giving way. He reached out and took my hand, his grip tight and desperate. "I'm so tired," he said. "I'm so tired of being angry." "Then stop," I whispered. "Just for tonight, stop." We sat there on the floor as the sun set over the valley, two broken people holding on to each other because we had nothing else left to hold.
Something changed between us after that night. Not everything. Garrett still kept his distance, still slept in his room downstairs while I stayed in mine, but the walls weren't as high. The silences weren't as cold. We started having breakfast together. Real conversations, not just logistics about the mill or the house. He told me about his time in college, studying engineering, dreaming about innovations for the lumber industry. I told him about my parents, how my mother used to sing while she cooked, how my father could fix anything with duct tape and determination. "You're like him," Garrett said one morning over coffee. "The way you tackled the garden, the accounting problems, you don't quit." "Neither do you," I said. "You just forgot for a while." The mill's situation was improving. With both of us working on it, we'd streamlined operations, cut unnecessary costs, renegotiated contracts with suppliers. The workers started seeing their paychecks grow. The town started breathing easier. But I noticed things that didn't add up. Garrett's physical therapy appointments were marked on the calendar, but he never came back looking tired or worked over. Sometimes I'd hear sounds from downstairs late at night, not the wheelchair, but footsteps, soft, careful, deliberate. One evening I came downstairs for water and found his wheelchair empty in the hallway. My heart stopped. I checked his room. The bed was made, but empty. I searched the study, the living room, panic rising in my chest. Then I saw him through the window, standing in the garden. Not holding on to anything, not struggling, just standing there in the moonlight, completely still, like he was remembering what it felt like to be whole. I watched him take 3 steps toward the rose bushes I'd been restoring. Smooth, controlled, perfect. Then he stopped, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath, and walked back to where his wheelchair sat hidden behind the hedge. My mind reeled. The wedding? The elders? The whole arrangement? None of it made sense if he could walk. I backed away from the window before he could see me, my heart hammering. Questions crashed through my mind like waves. How long had he been able to walk? Why was he hiding it? What did this mean about everything? Our marriage, the town, the life I thought I understood. I climbed the stairs to my room, my legs shaking. I should have felt angry, betrayed. Instead, all I felt was confusion and something else I couldn't name. Because if Garrett could walk, if he'd been pretending all this time, then everything the elders had told me was built on a lie. And if it was a lie, then why? Why would he choose this prison? Why would he accept a forced marriage, live in isolation, let the whole town believe he was helpless? I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until dawn, knowing that tomorrow everything would have to change. Tomorrow, I would have to confront the truth.
I didn't sleep. By the time morning light crept through my window, I'd rehearsed 100 different confrontations, each one falling apart before it began. How do you ask someone why they're pretending to be paralyzed? How do you unravel a deception that an entire town has built their hope around? I found him in the study at his usual time, working through paperwork, looking every bit the man confined to a wheelchair. My hands trembled as I poured coffee. "Garrett," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He looked up, and something in my tone must have warned him. His expression shifted, guarded. "What is it? Can you walk?" The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't deny it,
didn't act confused or offended. He just closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, like he'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "I saw you last night. In the garden." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I need to understand. The elders told me you were paralyzed. The whole town believes it. Why are you lying?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "When I first came home from the hospital, I couldn't walk. The doctor said the damage was permanent. For 6 months, that was my reality. Then one day, sensations started coming back. Within a year, I could stand. Another 6 months, I could walk." "That's wonderful," I said, confused. "Why wouldn't you tell anyone?" "Because of what happened when I tried." His jaw clenched. "I told the elders, Mrs. Hayes, Jasper, all of them. I thought they'd be happy. Instead, they asked me to keep it quiet." I stared at him. Why would they do that? The mill was failing even before I was injured. My mother had been mismanaging it for years, making poor investments, borrowing against future profits. When I came back paralyzed, the town rallied. They wanted to help the wounded veteran, protect the Sutherland legacy. Donations came in. People worked for reduced wages. Suppliers extended credit out of sympathy. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. "But if you recovered," I said slowly, "that sympathy would disappear." "Exactly." Jasper showed me the numbers. If people knew I could walk, the goodwill would vanish overnight. Creditors would demand payment. Workers would want fair wages we couldn't afford. The mill would collapse within months, and half the town would lose their jobs. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his legs. "They asked me to stay in the wheelchair, to keep pretending, to sacrifice my recovery for the greater good." "And the marriage?" I whispered. "My mother's dying wish was that I wouldn't be alone. The elders used that, combined it with their plan. They needed someone to manage the household, someone young and capable who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone desperate enough to accept the arrangement." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Isla. I wanted to tell you, but I was trapped in a lie that was supposed to save everyone, and instead it just kept destroying me piece by piece." I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. The forced marriage, my grandmother's debt, the weight of 43 families, all of it orchestrated around a deception. "So every day you pretend?" I said. "You sit in that wheelchair, let people pity you, give up your freedom, your dignity?" "What choice did I have?" he said, his voice rising. "Let the mill fail? Watch families lose everything? My driver died because of me, Isla. Jenkins, Martinez, Kowalski, they're gone because I made the wrong call. If staying in this wheelchair means their families and this town survive, then that's what I owe them. That's my penance." "That's not penance," I said fiercely. "That's self-destruction. You're burying yourself alive to pay for something that wasn't your fault, and the elders are letting you do it because it's convenient for them. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple." I stood up, my anger finally breaking through. "They're using your guilt to control you. They're using both of us, and I'm done being a pawn in their game." His eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" I looked at him, this brilliant, broken man who'd been sacrificing himself on an altar of other people's expectations, and made my decision. "I'm going to set us both free."
The next Sunday, I asked Garrett to call a town meeting at the community hall. He was terrified, but he trusted me. That alone felt like a miracle. The room filled quickly. The elders in the front row, mill workers and their families scattered throughout, curious faces wondering why the reclusive Sutherlands had summoned them. My grandmother sat near the back, her expression worried. Garrett rolled to the front of the room in his wheelchair. I stood beside him, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice carrying across the silent room. "I know many of you were at our wedding 5 weeks ago. You watched 2 strangers get married because you were told it would save this town. You were told Garrett needed care he couldn't provide for himself. You were told this sacrifice was necessary." Mrs. Hayes stood up. "Isla, this isn't appropriate." "Sit down," I said firmly. She did, shock written across her face.
I looked at Garrett. He was pale, but resolute. This was the moment. No going back. "My husband can walk," I said. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, confusion. I raised my hand for silence. "He's been able to walk for over a year." The elders knew. They asked him to keep pretending because they believed the mill needed the town's sympathy to survive. They orchestrated our marriage as part of that deception. They used his guilt, my desperation, and your goodwill to maintain a lie. Jasper Brennan stood up, his face red. "Now you wait just a minute." "No," Garrett said, and the authority in his voice silenced the room. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up from the wheelchair. The sound that went through the crowd was something between a gasp and a sob. People were crying, some in joy, some in anger. Garrett stood there, steady and strong, letting them see the truth. "Everything Isla said is accurate," he said. "I've been lying to you. The elders convinced me it was for the greater good, and I believed them because I was drowning in guilt over what happened overseas. I thought I deserved to be punished. I thought sacrificing my life was the least I could do." He looked at me, and something in his eyes made my breath catch. But my wife helped me see that I was wrong, not about wanting to help this town, I do, desperately, but about the method. You can't build something lasting on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Mrs. Hayes stood again, her voice shaking. "The mill will fail, without the sympathy, without the special considerations." "The mill is profitable," I interrupted, pulling out the ledgers we'd been working on. "It's been profitable for 3 months. Garrett's management and modernization plans are working. We don't need charity. We need honesty and hard work, which this town has never been short on." I turned to face everyone. "The elders thought they were saving you, but they were treating you like children who couldn't handle the truth. You deserve better. This town deserves better." An older mill worker named Raymond stood up. "So what happens now?" Garrett took a breath. "Now we move forward honestly. I'll keep running the mill, but as myself, not as someone you need to pity or protect. The profits will be shared fairly. No more special treatment, no more guilt-driven charity. Just good business and fair wages." "And the marriage?" someone called out. "Was that real or just part of the lie?" I looked at Garrett. He looked at me. In his eyes, I saw the man I'd discovered over these weeks. Brilliant, wounded, trying desperately to be good in a situation designed to break him. I saw the late-night conversations, the shared coffee, the moment he'd held my hand and admitted he was tired of being angry. "It started as a transaction," I said carefully, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." Garrett's hand found mine, his fingers warm and steady. "I don't know what we are yet," he said quietly, speaking to me though everyone was listening. "But I'd like the chance to find out, honestly. No more pretending, no more lies. Just 2 people trying to build something real." My grandmother was crying in the back row, not sad tears, something else, something like relief. "I'd like that too," I whispered. The meeting ended in chaos. Arguments, reconciliations, anger at the elders, relief about the mill. It would take time for the town to heal from the deception. Some people would forgive, others wouldn't. But that night, Garrett and I sat in the garden I'd restored, the one where I'd first seen him walk. The roses were blooming now, pink and white against the twilight sky. "I'm moving my things upstairs," he said, "to the room next to yours, if that's okay." "It's okay," I said. "This won't be easy," he warned, "learning how to be married for real, learning how to trust each other outside of crisis. Nothing worth having is easy." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, lighter, free. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "Thank you for standing up," I said, "in every way that matters." We sat there as stars appeared over the valley, 2 people who'd been forced together by lies and were choosing to stay together with truth. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better, a real beginning, messy and uncertain and entirely our own.
The sheets on the line had never looked so free.